Hi, and a great big welcome back to Women's Business Voice. I'm your host, Angela De Souza, in this fantastic series from side hustles to empires, history of working women's lives. Getting a bit tongue twisted today, sorry. So, in this episode, we're looking at how, for many women, working for themselves has been a strategy for making money at times when they had few other options. Dr. Aleena Din takes a look at post-war migration, discrimination in the labour market, and the ingenuity and entrepreneurialism of British South Asian women. So our guest, Dr. Aleena Din, is a historian who works on the relationship between gender, race and class in modern Britain. Her PhD focused on the migration, settlement and work experiences of British Pakistani women who settled in Middlesbrough and Oldham between the 1960s and early 2000s. She has been involved in a number of amazing research projects, including one, the Muslim History of Oxford, and a project that she worked on at the University of Bristol called Remaking Britain, South Asian Connections and Networks, 1830 to the present. Sounds fascinating, doesn't it? She is now just about to start a new job at the University of Manchester, which is very exciting. But before she does, she kindly agreed to join us today to talk about what work looked like for women migrating to Britain in the second half of the 20th century. So a great big welcome, Aleena. I'm going to hand over to my fantastic co-host, Dr. Amy Edwards. Take it away.
Hi, Aleena. Thank you so much for joining us. And Angela, as always, thank you for doing the job of introducing our speaker today, guest. Uh, but yeah, something that I've been asking everyone, Aleena, actually, when we start is just to tell us a bit about them, tell them about what led them to do the history they do. I mean, for folks who don't know, especially when you're proposing or starting a PhD project, you have quite a lot of freedom actually to propose to study something, I suppose, that you think is interesting, but also that you think might need some new light shed on it. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit about how you came to figure out what it was that you wanted to study and what led you to do the kind of research you do.
Sure. So my research primarily focuses on South Asians in Britain after 1945, particularly the experiences of South Asian women who live in the north of England. As you can tell by my accent, I am from the north of England. I'm British Pakistani. I'm second generation British Pakistani. And I think a lot of the motivations or, I guess the reasons underpinning my research are personally motivated. I remember finishing my undergraduate degree at the University of Glasgow and sort of being a bit lost about what I wanted to do. And it was around the same time that a big government report came out around integration. And one of the claims it made, which was quite controversial, was that British Pakistani and British Bangladeshi women were amongst the most economically inactive groups in the UK. And that in some way was indicative of a lack of integration, is some of the language that was used. And that felt very different from my experiences. I saw women working all the time and multiple jobs and also taking care of their families, being really engaged in their local communities. And I guess that sort of set me on a path to figure out why it was that what was being said in the media and politics was so disconnected from my personal experiences. And that, I guess, set me off on a journey to do this research of speaking to the women who, I guess, the grandmas and aunties and mothers who made up the community I was part of, and extending that research to do a big social history of modern Britain, which centers, a group of people who are often talked about, but not really, spoken to, and give women, I guess, some scope to share their personal testimonies and in turn challenge this idea that South Asian women don't work.
Yeah, amazing. And I think it just speaks to how important it is as well um, that like lots of different people go through university, lots of different people do history degrees and all sorts of degrees, so that there are these different voices um, in the discipline, in the academy, out in the world, telling different people's stories, so that it doesn't, we don't end up kind of just telling the same kind of story over and over again. And I should say I'm a really big fan of Aleena and her work, so this is really exciting to get to have an excuse to ask you more about it. And I know Angela mentioned in her introduction that you've been working on a couple of different projects. So before we jump into more about your research, I wondered if you could just tell us a bit more about them. I know you've been working on one here at Bristol. If there was anything you wanted to say about the stuff you've been doing recently.
Sure. So I've been really lucky to be part of a big research team at the University of Bristol and colleagues at Queen Mary University of London and partners at the British Library. We've been working on a digital humanities project titled Remaking Britain, South Asian Connections and Networks, 1830 to the Present. And the project is really to, I guess, try and unveil and highlight the long and embedded presence of South Asians in Britain from 1830 to the present, looking at archives across the UK to try and uncover local and national stories connected to the histories of modern Britain across the mid to late 19th and I guess late 20th century up until the present. So it's a big project in terms of time period and geographies, but it's been an incredibly intellectually fulfilling one in that I've had the opportunity to situate my research interests on South Asian women after 1945 in a much broader history. And we've produced a website which is free and publicly accessible. It's southasianbritain.org. And that highlights a breadth of research. It largely constitutes of 750 entries on South Asian people, events, and organizations, and the ways in which they're connected to one another. So the events that people took part in, the organizations they were connected to, as well as around 30 original oral history interviews with South Asians from across the UK from a wide range of backgrounds. And those were conducted by colleagues at Queen Mary. So it's a major educational resource. It's one that we hope will be used in research and in the classroom, and one that speaks to a wide range of audiences. So yeah, that's the work I've been doing at Bristol, and it's been the work that's preoccupied my time for the past few years.
Yeah, perfect. And I mean, in some ways, very handy for us today because we have someone here who is an expert in the history of British South Asian communities. So, for folks who are a bit less familiar with what some of that history looks like, I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about that, like why and when did South Asian folks kind of establish themselves in Britain throughout the 20th century? What was life like for people who did come and settle in Britain, or who kind of started up families or were born into South Asian families in Britain? Like, tell us some of the history of that community, if you don't mind.
Sure. I guess I'd start by saying South Asians constitute the largest migrant group in Britain. So it is a massive and arguably under-researched population of people. And its history, the history of South Asians in Britain can date back centuries. But I think, the 1830s, as, a pioneering historian of this area, Rosina Visram said, in the 1830s, you start seeing the formation of South Asian communities. And it is, it is inextricably linked to British colonialism, right? Of a form of circular migration, I guess, of people being able to move between the subcontinent and Britain. And in turn, you see some people, that experiences being more transient, such as students or, seamen, also called lascars, ayahs who are nannies, and then people who established a more permanent settlement, and generations of people who have called towns and cities across the UK their home. And I think where you see maybe a fundamental shift is towards the mid 20th century after the Second World War. So we see in 1962 the enactment of the Commonwealth Immigration Act, which was the first legislation to, I guess, control the movement of Commonwealth migrants across the UK. And it meant that those who had come to Britain in search of work or education had to make a decision whether to go back to the subcontinent and risk not being able to come back to the UK, or whether to call their families to the UK and establish a more permanent settlement. And the latter was a very popular option for people. And that's how you end up with families, I guess, settling in the UK. And the exponential growth of South Asian populations across the UK. I mean, I think there is a real emphasis on the histories of South Asians in England in particular, but our research has highlighted that this was taking part in urban and rural geographies across Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well. So that diversity of experiences and embeddedness, I think, is a really important element of this history too. But yeah, we see this change happening in around 1962. And a lot of that movement, I guess, underpinning that movement was the type of work people did. So, the work that people did really determined whether or not they would be, I guess, given permission to settle in the UK. So in so many ways, the movement and settlement of South Asians in Britain is almost inextricably linked to, economic modernization in the UK, the rebuilding of post-war Britain. And for a lot of women I spoke to, South Asian women, specifically British Pakistani women who settled in the UK, where they lived was really determined by the type of work their husbands, fathers, or sons did. So they were really put in a position to navigate places and local economies that really weren't of their choosing. And yet, I guess we'll go on to discuss later, they managed to find ways to make it work.
Yeah, amazing. And I mean, that leads us really nicely. The next thing I was going to ask you about was about a bit more specifically about your research and the research that underpinned your PhD, but that you're kind of continuing on with, which does look at the lives of British Pakistani women, and particularly in Northern England, as you mentioned earlier. So I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that project, and I guess how you found out about the lives of these women. What does that historical research look like? Yeah, anything you have to say on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my PhD research, which I did at the University of Oxford, is finished in 2022, focused on British Pakistani women's formal and informal labour. So like I mentioned earlier, there was a real disconnect between what was being said in the media and politics at the time that, I was thinking about this research and my personal experiences. But I think there was a much broader, I guess, analysis to be had of what work constitutes. And for me, it seemed quite interesting to center the experiences of a group that are amongst the lowest paid in Britain to then, I guess, unpack what work means. And in using women's work, their everyday activity as a starting point of analysis, I was able to, I guess, uncover a wide range of experiences. What came out of that wasn't just, experiences of formal work, but it was voluntary labor, self-employment, it was domestic labor, lots of different forms of unpaid work, but also experiences of coming of age, of community relations, of, I guess the building of mosques and community centers, as well as, experiences of friendship. It, it really encompassed, a breadth of experiences, and women were really eager to share those testimonies with me. So I collected oral history interviews in Middlesbrough and Oldham, Middlesbrough being a heavy industry centre, Oldham being a light industry textile centre. And I collected the testimonies of women, and there were life histories. I sort of realised early on that the word work was loaded, that it wasn't, a lot of women were very quick to say that, oh, I didn't work. So like, I've got nothing to say or add. So it became important to collect these life history interviews and to, give women the space to define their everyday activity on their own terms. In some instances, the activity that women described would fit any definition of work that, a government or a scholar would, adopt. But in other ways, they really challenge the fundamentals of how we define work, and a definition of work adopted by the state, which often, is focused on taxation or the management of workers, but which really, makes invisible the bulk of activity that women undertake, not just in the UK, but globally, particularly unpaid labour. So a lot of the research was rooted in that oral history, and it's something that I continue to do, using women's life histories as the starting point of analysis.
And so when you're talking about life histories, just to double check, so is that sort of going and like talking to someone and like what does a life history entail?
So it's, I guess, starting from the beginning, like really trying to do a really expansive, I guess, conversation, discussion about someone's experiences. So I do go in with a set of questions, and like I have some thoughts of the type of information that I hope to get from this conversation, but it is literally starting from, where were you born? What was your family like growing up? what was your environment like, but then also throwing in questions like what types of chores did you do? What did other women, type of work did women do when you were growing up? And then using that to sort of develop, I guess, a line of inquiry that extends across someone's life cycle, and delves into lots of different elements of someone's life in a way that might sound strange to the person. It's like, why are you asking me about, what GCSEs I did, for example? But it really does help construct a more holistic understanding of the type of not only work or labor people engaged in, but also the ways in which they engaged with systems, related to people's work activities, such as education, training, their relationship to the labor market, their access to childcare, and so on.
Yeah, perfect. And I mean, I guess the next obvious question is, are there any like particular stories that you encountered that you were really struck by, or any of the women that you spoke to who kind of have those things that really stick out in your mind or like stuck with you, I guess?
There are so many. I think it was the most, I guess, like revelatory experience of speaking to these women. I think one of the most profound experiences was the first woman I interviewed for the project, and this was all the way back in 2018. And she was the first Pakistani woman to settle in Middlesbrough. So this was around 1959. And, had in so many ways was cited as a leader in the community, was an important elder in the Pakistani community in Middlesbrough. And, I went in, she was so lovely, wanted to share so much about her experiences of living in the town. But when it came to questions of work, was really reluctant. She would say things like, well, no one worked here, which is sort of true. If you look at the statistics of women's employment in Middlesbrough, it is amongst the lowest in the UK in comparison to national statistics, given the dominance of the steel industry, which would primarily, employ men, given the need for a certain form of physical labor. But she was adamant, I didn't work, the women I knew didn't work. And she alluded to, I guess, being involved in some sense in a family business. Her husband was established the first halal butchers in Middlesbrough. Again, I guess in his experiences in some way highlighting the ways in which South Asian communities, in this case, Pakistani Muslim communities, were navigating a local economy that just wasn't suited to a permanent settlement. But he died suddenly, and then she became responsible for financially supporting her children. She had 5 children. And it was really only 45 minutes into the conversation that she was like, yes, I had a business. I owned a fabric shop and I would sell fabric. She said she was the first person to establish this type of business, which if you go into Middlesbrough town centre now, you can see on almost every corner. But that reluctance or that lack of connection with the word work, and I should say, like I conducted the interview in Punjabi, so I try to, as far as possible, create scope for this interviewee to interpret the term work on her own terms. And it seemed like her interpretation was, well, work is something that takes place outside the home, that is, waged and formalized, not self-employment, despite the fact that her husband owned his own business as well. And it was, I guess, really highlighted something that would come up again and again and again in interviews, that the word work just did not necessarily elicit the types of responses that I thought I would get if I asked people about their labor and their everyday activity. And yeah, that one really, it was striking. And it, set the tone for the rest of the interviews. And I guess really prepared me as an interviewer to expect that almost. Like, I guess a lot of reflection of the words that we use and I guess the context in which we use them may be limiting the types of responses that we might get from an interview like that. So that was one really, important experience and one that really set the tone for the rest of my research. And the other was in Oldham of meeting the daughters of home workers. And home working is a really interesting topic. So for those who don't know, home working is, undertaking I guess, various forms of work like seamstressing or assembling Christmas crackers or celebration cards in a domestic setting. So it is, often corporations or, larger businesses that are employing often, for the most part, women, migrant women, to manufacture these items in a domestic premise. And I knew that this phenomenon had taken place. I just didn't know how many women were partaking in this form of work in Oldham. And I met the daughters of some of those women, as well as some former home workers. And the sense I got was the vast majority of South Asian women, Pakistani women, in Oldham had at some point partaken in that work or were related to someone who had. And it was, that was fascinating because it highlighted, I guess, a dimension of these histories of deindustrialization, which, really are quite popular in, modern British history. These big stories, it revealed another dimension that when, the mills closed in places like Oldham, corporations looked to an expendable workforce, South Asian women who were eager to find forms of work that, they could do alongside managing childcare or other domestic or community-based responsibilities. I guess that testimony of, the children of these women saying, I fell asleep to the sound of a sewing machine, or we played games of picking up thread from the carpet, or, some of these children being responsible for cooking and cleaning because of the exacting standards of their mother's employers, really opened up an area of research that I did not envisage when I designed the project of, a form of work that was amongst the lowest paid in mid to late 20th century Britain. And that also sits, I guess, in this grey area between employment and self-employment, which got to the crux, I guess, of so many debates that were happening, even in the Houses of Parliament about what this work was. That, if you're able to do this work at home, some would argue that you would have control over your, working conditions, that you had a level of flexibility that would allow you to take care of your children or take care of your families, and that this money served as pin money because it was so low paid. The other side, you have, other politicians saying, no, like what you're creating is an unregulated workplace that is, I guess, yeah, like women being exposed to incredibly dangerous, working environments, but also being paid pennies for the items that they made, and therefore working endless hours to make any form of a livable income. And those debates really, I guess, highlighting the the challenging and yet significant histories of economic change in the mid to late 20th century, particularly around deindustrialization. So again, it is, I guess the thread that connects a lot of my research is what happens to those histories when you center the experiences of people who have not been researched and have not really been given the space to share what their everyday experiences look like in relation to this major social and economic change.
Yeah, it's amazing, Aleena, and it's like really wonderful to hear you talk about both like the big picture stuff that you're interested in, but then also how that relates to these like very personal individual lives of the different women that you've spoken to. And I guess one of the things that is really interesting is how you kind of navigate that kind of those two bits, like the big stories and the little stories that make them up. And we want to avoid sort of flattening experience down to a homogenizing group that doesn't really actually account for those voices and those stories. But I wondered if you had any thoughts really on why it's so important to tell these kind of histories, and something about that relationship between race, but also class and also gender, and how in how these women experienced what work was or what work meant to them, or in many cases, the fact that they just didn't identify with this idea of work at all because it looked like something for other people.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's one that is so pertinent to the politics of today, which I think is why it's remains fundamental to analyze these histories, because they're so deeply entwined in some of the most contentious debates in contemporary politics and society. I guess, as I said earlier, like you can't, I guess you cannot really trace a history of South Asians in Britain without really reckoning with this idea of racial capitalism, of groups of people essentially coming to be, in so many ways, economically exploited to do the labor that white workers had refused. That has always been an area of interest, in part because it really challenges this idea of like, you know, taking our jobs or like, this discourse around, go home. It's like, no, these, at least I can speak to my personal history. My grandparents were invited to this country to do that work and are fundamental to this broader history of, post-war reconstruction. So I guess really using individual testimony experiences as a starting point refines these big ideas, and we can move, from the really granular, the home and families and these very local communities to the national and then the global. Like history of migration is inextricably linked to a history of Britain in the 20th century. Where it becomes really interesting for me is trying to figure out where gender inequality fits into these experiences. Particularly very timely, with the Sex Discrimination Act anniversary this year, the 50th anniversary. Do these histories map on to the experiences of the women I spoke to? And in so many ways it didn't, right? Like there are really interesting testimonies of women highlighting that their inaccess to the labor market was so laid, where, there's a really amazing book by an economist called Naila Kabir, who made the point that, when it came to factory work, for example, men would often cite, Bangladeshi men in particular, would often cite, their lack of education or training of being a reason why they undertook factory labor. And those very reasons underpinning why women didn't have access to a form of, formal work or waged work, which is really interesting, right? Like the very notion that even, what some, like, I guess in some government statistics or even some scholars might regard as unskilled work, that was also inaccessible to a group of women who, by many accounts wanted to earn a living. And this is where self-employment becomes a really interesting point, as a mechanism of survival versus something that is, for pin money, or something that is like, I guess we have this idea of what entrepreneurialism looks like, of something that is empowered and empowering. For a lot of the women I spoke to, these forms of work that often remain invisible, voluntary work, this very casual form of self-employment was fundamental to their survival. And again, it's because of this, the I guess the type of labor women around the world are undertaking, the forms of domestic and unpaid labor that constitutes women's activity every day. When, there are systemic gender and racial inequalities in terms of access to welfare, for example, you can see why women respond in very specific and particular ways when it comes to their, their waged or income earning experiences. And it often is with the view that, the state isn't necessarily the source of support that it might be for others, and therefore, taking on work or trying to navigate local economies in a really creative way becomes fundamental to just being able to survive, to be able to take care of your families, to be able to secure a comfortable and more permanent settlement in a place that is so distant from, the places that many of my interviewees grew up.
I think, Aleena, actually, that's probably a really powerful place to end, and it really speaks to some of the other themes, the other episodes that we've had, and some of the ones we've got coming up, of really thinking about just the ingenuity in systems or times where I guess people will sometimes feel excluded, or that there aren't things in place. That's when people kind of find these amazing ways to like make money, to make community, to make a life for themselves. And it sounds like so many of the women that you spoke to that was really that's kind of the thing that they all shared, even with their different stories and different kind of experiences. It's this kind of will to make a living, whatever that looked like, whether that was financially or like family or to make community. So yeah, I think a really wonderful. You paint a wonderful picture, and I think the work that you do is so important and so interesting. So thank you so much for sharing some of it with us, and for adding to our series, and giving voice, or at least sharing the voices of all those women that you spoke to. I just think is amazing. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for joining us on Women's Business Voice, where women rise, lead, and make an impact. If you loved today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a woman who needs to hear this. Want more inspiration? Visit womensbusiness.club to connect, grow, and be seen. Until next time, keep showing up powerfully. The world needs what only you can bring.